A story about a couple who, after almost 30 years of a peaceful life, faced a crisis, but instead of divorce, found new meaning in mutual support and quiet understanding. In the town of Charter Grove, where the grass was always a little taller than it should be and the porches seemed like stages for silent observers, lived two families, the Graves and the Mitchells. Their houses stood opposite each other, a light gray with blue shutters and a pale yellow with a peeling porch. The inhabitants of both houses lived in their own rhythms, without much warmth, but also without open hostility. Everything was familiar, stable, predictable. In the Graves' house lived Eleanor. She was a woman who never left the dishes until morning, wore comfortable shoes, and trimmed the bushes in front of the house every week to keep the paths from growing overgrown. Her husband, Harold, was silent and careful, once worked for an insurance company and now spent most of his days in the garage, where he organized a collection of old wrenches. They had been together for almost 30 years, and neither of them had ever raised their voices. When Harold said one evening that he wanted a divorce, Eleanor held the watering can in her hand. She simply stopped watering the flower pot and looked at him with the same composure with which she always greeted the changes in the weather. He explained that he had been thinking a lot. He said that he missed life, that he had a feeling that something had passed him by, and that he wanted to go on a trip that he had once planned before the wedding, to cross the country in an old pickup truck, staying in campgrounds and photographing abandoned gas stations. But Eleanor didn't agree. Not because she was against his travels, and not because she was afraid of being alone. She refused to grant the divorce the next day after she found out one thing: Harold had been coming to the Mitchell house across the street every Tuesday for 6 months. Not to Joan, who lived there with her daughter, but to the basement, where old Henry lived, Joan's father, who had long since stopped going outside and hardly talked to anyone anymore. Harold would bring him books, repair the socket, listen to his long stories about his youth. And then he would come home, silently wipe his hands with a towel and sit down to dinner. Eleanor found out about this by accident. She saw through the window how the man was carrying an old lamp out of the Mitchell house. She asked Joan, but she didn't hide anything. She said that Harold had been coming to her father for a long time, because it was difficult for him to be alone. That was enough. Not because Eleanor was jealous or offended. Because it revealed something deeper. Harold was looking for meaning not in running away from home but in being needed by someone. And Eleanor decided that was the reason they were staying together. That spring Chester Road began to change. The Mitchells had re-roofed the roof and the Graves had painted the fence. Eleanor began to sit on the porch more often. Harold drove out of town once a week, he said, just to see how the skyline had changed. Eleanor didn't ask where he was going. She knew he needed to be alone. And that this wasn't an escape, this was a return. Joan, across the street, had started hanging her washing out more often, even though she had a clothes dryer. Eleanor realized that this was an excuse to go outside, to talk to the wind. Sometimes she would wave to Eleanor, and she would wave back. There was never any conversation, but the air between their houses became different, less frozen. One day Eleanor brought Joan a homemade pie. Not with apologies, not with questions, just as a gesture. She knew that Harold was not in love, not looking for another woman. It was not passion that held him, but an old cellar where someone needed his hands. Weeks passed. Henry died in August, quietly, in his sleep, with a book on his chest. Harold was at the funeral, standing aside. Eleanor was there too, though she didn't know if she should. But she came because she knew it was part of her marriage, too. In the fall, Harold said he didn't want to go on the trip anymore. He had already sensed what was missing. And now, it seemed, the house had taken on a new shape. Eleanor didn't ask why. She simply made tea every day, bought new seeds for the flower bed, read books, and waited for the evenings when the shadow would appear on the porch, calm, familiar, her own. Nothing much happened in Charter Grove. But something had changed in these houses. The Mitchells and Graves had not become friends, but they no longer seemed like spectators in each other's lives. They had become a backdrop against which something valuable had been preserved: silence, forbearance, and the decision to stay, not because they had to, but because it would have been too easy otherwise. The autumn in Charter Grove was long. The leaves did not fall, but hung on the trees, as if deciding whether to stay a little longer or yield to the wind. The smell of apples and wood smoke lingered in the air, and the evenings grew quieter, though nothing had changed. People simply spoke less, not because they were tired, but because words were no longer the main thing. Harold spent more time in the garden. It was hardly a garden, there was nothing to harvest. There, just grass, low bushes, a few frost-scorched plants. He had marked out a few beds, sprinkled the paths with sawdust, but he had planted nothing. Eleanor would sometimes look at him from the kitchen window. She knew it wasn't for the harvest. It was for order. Music was coming more and more from the house opposite. Joan, a widow with thin arms and dark dresses, would open the windows while she ironed her laundry. Eleanor paid no attention to it, but Harold would sometimes stop in the middle of the path when he heard a familiar tune. It must have been something from the past, from the days when cars had smooth lines and radios still crackled. After Henry died, Joan had started to work more in the garden. Her beds were well tended. The currant bushes were leveled, and rows of marigolds had appeared under the windows. She planted flowers with the precision of someone searching for an answer. Eleanor understood this better than she would admit. There had been many such periods in her life. 2. One day Harold brought home an old projector. It had been in a box since the 1980s, with instructions that had yellowed with age. Eleanor said nothing as he set it up in the guest room. The next evening they watched slides from their trip to Vermont. The snow on the roof of the house, photos of them standing by a tree, holding hot chocolate. The room smelled of dust. But the warmth of the lamp on the slides was like the sun. Harold said he would find more film. Eleanor just nodded. In the weeks that followed, he went through all the old boxes in the attic. There were his college notebooks, postcards from distant relatives, a few records that had long since stopped playing clearly. He didn't throw anything away. He simply put them in new boxes and signed them Autumn 1982, a trip to my sister, home. Mornings. Eleanor. In November, Joan stopped hanging out her laundry in the yard. Her clothesline remained empty, and the windows were closed more often. Eleanor noticed one morning that the grass by her fence had not been cut, and that was a sign. Joan always watched the grass. It wasn't alarming, just unusual. And it was these changes, small, almost imperceptible, that sometimes spoke of something more important. In December, Harold thought again about his trip. Not with sadness, but with irony. He said that perhaps it was a good thing he hadn't gone, because now he could see that home was not just a place to store things. It was a place where there was someone who didn't ask why you had come back. Eleanor didn't answer. She was baking cookies, and the kitchen smelled of cinnamon. At such moments, words lost their weight. Silence meant more than consent. When winter came, the houses disappeared in the snowdrifts. The neighbors rarely went outside, but the lights in their windows said that everyone was still. Joan rarely opened the windows, but sometimes Eleanor would see her silhouette against the yellow light, in the same dark dress, with a book in her hands. One Christmas Eve, Harold hung up a garland. For the first time in many years. It was old, a little uneven, but it glowed with a soft light. Eleanor looked at it for a long time before turning it on herself. It wasn't about the holiday. It was about the gesture. After the holidays, Joan disappeared from the yard for a few days. Eleanor saw only her daughter, who took out the trash or checked the mail. Joan's absence was palpable, though. No one spoke of it. And one morning Harold said he had seen her in the clinic downtown. She was sitting by the window, her hands on her knees, staring into space. Eleanor baked a cake. She didn't know if it was appropriate, but she brought it to Joan without explanation, without intention. She just put it by the door and turned back. The winter had been long. But it wasn't cold. There was something new in the walls of the house, not warmth, but peace. Harold turned on the projector more often. Eleanor bought new curtains. And a few days later Joan's clothesline was back on. The world in Charter Grove was still the same. But there were more decisions made. Silently, and held for years. The snow didn't come off right away. It melted slowly, leaving thin silver streaks along the curbs, blurred by the morning shadows. Harold checked the forecast every morning, as if he could change something about it, but the temperature stayed around zero, and it wasn't until March that the ground began to breathe moisture. Eleanor didn't wait for spring, she just knew it would come. Like any other day, without ceremony, simply because it had to. Harold visited the garage less often, as if he felt that winter had already done its job. The house was quiet, but not empty. Eleanor listened more often to new sounds, the noise of the refrigerator, which fell silent for a few minutes, the crackle of wood under the floor, the ticking of an old clock that hadn't kept time for a long time but never stopped. These sounds seemed to her a sign of a life that was not in a hurry, did not run away, did not need anything extra. In the neighborhood, things went their own way, too. Joan would occasionally appear on the porch, sometimes hanging out towels, sometimes just sitting there, holding a steaming cup in her hand, as if to show that the weather was still warm, despite the calendar. She didn't wave at Eleanor, but she didn't turn away. Sometimes it seemed like an invisible agreement to be there without approaching. One evening Eleanor saw Joan hanging a small wreath of dry branches on the door. Not festive, not ornate, just a ring of vine tied with string. There was something soothing about it, an acknowledgement of the presence of time, which carried on without asking permission. Eleanor thought she might as well do something like that. She went to the pantry, took out an old box of string, dried berries, and scraps of fabric, and began to weave her own wreath. The hands moved slowly, as if the memory in her fingers was older than the memory in her head. A new notebook appeared on the kitchen table. Eleanor began to jot down dates, not events, but moods. She wrote about the smell of the morning air, the sound of the wind in the chimney, the colors of the sky on the third Thursday of the month. These were not notes for anyone, not a diary or a souvenir. Just an attempt to capture the shadow of each day that passed without leaving a trace. When true spring came, it didn't announce itself with flowers or birdsong. It simply brought a softer light. The dust that had once been just dirt suddenly became part of the space, crumbs of memory swirling in it. Harold opened the windows more often, sat on the porch with a cup of tea held in both hands. He was 68, but there was something youthful about him, not in his face, but in the silence with which he looked at things. One day Eleanor found an old map on the kitchen table. It was folded in half, the edges curled, and marked with a pencil. Beside it lay a notebook with notes, old stations, southern line, turns by the pines. She didn't ask what that meant. She just took a pen and signed it. In the corner, return. She knew that these were not plans. It was an attempt to see something familiar again, but from a different perspective. Harold didn't go on a journey. He simply began driving his old car to the old railway platforms. Every Sunday, stopping at them, taking pictures, and returning home before dinner. Eleanor didn't ask why. She just handed him clean napkins and cleared the map from the kitchen table. There were journeys in her own life too, internal, invisible ones. She would sort through old napkins, embroider ornaments, bake pies that no one asked for but always ate. In the spring the grass grew back taller than it should have. Harold had cut it 3 times. Joan once. Eleanor had only watched it from the window. She understood that sometimes grass was not just green. It was what brought a person back to movement, to action, to herself. Now, when she walked to the mailbox, her shadow fell on the gravel, lay flat, without distortion. She no longer looked back. Not because she was indifferent. Simply because there were fewer questions in her life and more peace. She knew that nothing had disappeared. Everything that was supposed to remain remained. By summer, everything had finally fallen into place. The walls in the house did not creak at night, as they did in winter. The cupboards did not sag, and the old shelves in the pantry kept silence, as if they were guarding something. There was pollen in the air, it settled on the windowsills and tablecloths, got into the books and lingered between the pages. Eleanor did not put it away immediately. She watched it slowly cover things, and she thought that sometimes time showed itself like that, as a thin, almost invisible layer. On Saturday, Harold did not go anywhere. He left the map on the table by the window and went out into the garden with the sécateur. Eleanor did not ask why. She knew that sometimes even familiar routes were tiring. Sometimes a person had to stay within the limits of what he already knew. Not out of fear. Out of a need to be in place. In the garden, Harold trimmed bushes, raked up dead branches, put them in bags. His movements were not hurried, but precise. Eleanor watched from the veranda. She held the embroidery in her hands, but she did not embroider, she simply touched the canvas, the threads, what was to become the pattern. These days, actions were not mandatory. Being nearby was enough. On the table next to her was an old photo album, open to a page where they were both very young, against the ocean, in sunny clothes, slightly tanned, with smiles they no longer wore. But even these old pictures didn't make them feel longing. They were witnesses. And that was enough. Joan also sat outside more often. She read on a bench under a tree, sometimes falling asleep with a book in her hands. Her daughter came less often, but she left bags of groceries on the doorstep. Eleanor saw these bags and sometimes remembered how she herself had once brought similar things to her mother. In the same silence, with the same gestures. Without words. In July, the rain came again. It poured quietly, as if it were unsure of itself. The drops ran down the windows, down the tin eaves, down the remnants of branches on the path. Harold sat in the garage, without turning on the light. Eleanor cooked dinner without turning on the radio. Everything was calm. Like water that doesn't flow but doesn't stand still. One morning Eleanor woke up early. She went outside, still in her dressing gown, barefoot, and stopped by the old tree that Harold had planted. Its trunk was uneven, cracked, but alive. A few small shoots grew nearby, new ones that had sprouted on their own, without permission. She reached out, touched the bark, felt the roughness under her fingers as confirmation. Back inside, she made coffee, poured it into 2 cups, and left one by the Window. Harold didn't take it right away, but he did. This went on for several weeks. The air grew heavier, closer to the August heat. The garden gradually turned yellow, the grass faded, the apples fell silently. Eleanor no longer embroidered, she sorted the fabrics, sorted the scraps, arranging them by color. Harold began to sort books instead. Old detective stories, pre-war novels, plant catalogs. He piled them up, signed the boxes, set aside a few volumes. Eleanor noticed that among them was an album of train photographs. His hands lingered on it longer. In early September, Harold spoke of the old barn. He said it needed either to be repaired or torn down. But he did neither. He just sat nearby, on a stool, watching the broken plank sway in the wind. Eleanor sometimes put a thermos of tea next to him, not always, but sometimes. He never left it full. Life flowed outwards, not inwards. They no longer tried to change the space, they just kept it in balance. Eleanor knew that autumn would be mild, and in winter the slide projector would come back on. Harold would probably find another film. And she would cook an old dish she had made in her early years. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to remember what it smelled like. The lilacs were ripe in the yard. They opened at the wrong time, a little late, as if they had mixed something up. But that didn't surprise anyone. They picked a few branches and put them in water. The flowers lasted a long time, almost until the rains. Eleanor checked every morning to see if the petals had fallen. They fell only after no one had asked them anymore. In the evening Harold lit the lamp that had not been lit for a long time and said it was time to choose a new map. He began to make routes again, not to travel, but to remember. In December, warm rugs appeared on the floor. Eleanor spread them out without purpose, just to make the steps soft. Harold brought a new can of coffee and put it on the shelf, although the old one was not finished yet. They began to watch old recordings from the video camera, not every day, but sometimes. The recordings were grainy, dark, with distorted sound. But they had everything: the movement of hands, smiles, the voices of children who no longer lived nearby. When the snow fell on the yard again, it no longer seemed clean or festive. It was just snow, part of a cycle. Eleanor stopped waiting for spring, Harold stopped watching the forecast. They both knew winter would last as long as it needed to. There was something right about it. Something that finally didn't need an excuse. Their days became softer. They didn't count time, they didn't set goals. When the tea was finished, they made new tea. When it got dark, they turned on the light. There was no silence in the house, because silence was no longer perceived as absence. It was a form of presence, like air, like light, like the touch of old wood. In mid-September, the mornings became mistier. Eleanor would wake up before sunrise, open the kitchen windows and leave them open to smell the damp air. The dampness carried with it the smells of wood, soggy soil, old paint, and those apples that kept falling from the orchard even when the trees seemed empty. Harold got up a little later, made coffee, and closed the windows, but he never scolded Eleanor. He knew that these mornings meant something to her. They didn't live by the news, didn't follow other people's lives, didn't discuss letters that arrived with great delay. The mailbox was just a symbol of the cycle, like the kitchen clock. For minutes behind but still ticking. Everything in the house was not exactly precise, and that was what made it cozy. Nothing was in a hurry, nothing demanded answers. In the garden was an old wooden chair that Harold had dragged out of the basement. He had placed it under a pear tree, not far from a low flower bed that had long since lost its shape. Sometimes Eleanor sat on this chair knitting or just with her hands empty. She didn't knit seriously, she just held the thread between her fingers, watching it pass through the loops. She wasn't interested in the result, only in the process. Later, when the first leaves began to fall, she and Harold began to walk the paths outside the city again. It was not a walk in the full sense of the word, more like movement in space, an attempt to confirm that it was still possible to reach the familiar fence, to that stone by the road, to the old broken signpost. They did not speak, they did not exchange glances, but they felt each other. It was not love in the classical sense, and it was not a duty. It was a mutual perception of the silence that held them around the things they shared. In early October, Harold began to organize the collection of photos that he had collected since his youth. Black and white photographs, color films, printed pages with captions that had already faded. He sat in the living room, arranged them in series on the folding table. Bridges, trains, shops that are no longer. Eleanor didn't interfere at first, but one day she brought in some old autographs she used to glue to her albums. They didn't fit, but Harold tucked them in between the pages just so they would be there. These days had a different weight to them, as if the world had slowed down a bit to give them a chance to recover. The wind would bring dry leaves to the door, and Harold wouldn't sweep them away. He would leave them there, watching them dissipate over time. Eleanor didn't bake pies, buy candles, or decorate the house. She let autumn just be autumn, without signs or gestures. Joan had left pots of chrysanthemums outside her house several times. Eleanor would see them, and each time she would mentally mark them, October. These flowers didn't bring joy. But they didn't bring sadness either. They were a sign of duration, a sign that the season was continuing, even if the days were getting shorter. At night, the distant train signals began to sound. Harold sometimes sat by the open window and listened. Eleanor knew he didn't have to go anywhere, it was enough for him to know that they were still running. One day she took out of an old box a blanket she had knitted many years ago. It was untied, with a few squares left. Eleanor decided to finish it. She found some yarn that roughly matched the color and began to work. Her fingers remembered how to do it, and her head rested. In the evening she covered the chair by the window with a blanket. Harold said nothing, but from then on he always sat there. November brought rain. It was patchy, short, but it left puddles on the road. Eleanor looked out the windows every morning and looked for shade. When there was none, she knew it was going to rain. These days they cooked soups, warmed bread, wore thick socks. Harold sometimes read old newspaper clippings aloud, though to no one in particular. It was more like a ritual: read, crumple, throw away. At the end of the month, Eleanor found an old box of her father's things. She opened it, sitting on the floor, and slowly went through each item. There were old letters, tools, keys, a few watches that didn't work. She didn't cry, she didn't remember out loud. She just dusted them off and put them back. January brought slow days. Eleanor knew that this was not a month for change, but for quiet preservation. The snow no longer fell in gusts, it fell flat, almost vertically, like a speck of dust on a polished surface. Harold looked into the basement more often. It was not very cold there, but it smelled of metal and dust and old paint. He pulled out boxes of buttons that he had once collected, not for sewing but for sorting by shape, weight, color. Eleanor helped sort them, not for anything, just for the sake of it. When they returned from the city, slowly, pausing at the windows that were no longer lit, they always stopped at the same coffee shop. It was small, smelled of dried fruit and dust. The owner, an old man, hardly ever spoke, but he always set the same thing on the table: 2 drinks, 1 cookie. Harold divided the cookies in half. Eleanor left her share on the napkin. They both knew it didn't change anything, but it was what kept them in the same rhythm. Towards February, Harold began to draw maps on paper, not geographical maps, but internal ones. On one sheet of paper he depicted the house, every room, the doors, the windows, the sounds they made. Eleanor also undertook a similar process. She sketched a diagram of the garden, not as it had once been, but as she remembered it. There were trees that had long since disappeared, and paths that had long since grown over. But that was what was real to her, not the state of things, but how she had preserved them in her memory. One evening, when snow had fallen thickly on the windowsill, they reread together the notes they had left each other in the past, on the refrigerator door, on the bathroom mirror, on the pages of magazines. The paper had turned yellow, the ink had faded, but some of the phrases still held weight. They were few, for they were never verbose. But each word had its own volume, like a candle that does not shine brightly, but burns long. When the frosts passed, and the water from the roof began to flow in drops that beat on the windowsill, Eleanor began to embroider. It was an old habit that she had long since abandoned. She chose a dark blue background in gold threads. Lines appeared on the fabric, like the movement of stars. She did not know what exactly she was embroidering. It was a process, not a result. Harold brought an old lantern that had once hung in the barn, cleaned it and put it on the chest of drawers. In the evenings they lit it, even though they had electricity. They liked the soft light. In early March, the first signs of thaw appeared in the yard. Water ran down the paths, leaving dark lines. Harold brought out an old shovel, not for work, but simply to hold in his hands. Eleanor watched him from the kitchen window. She drank tea with lemon, though she didn't like sour things. The feeling was more important than the taste. They didn't plan for spring, they didn't buy new seeds, they didn't make notes. There was no forethought in their actions, only reaction to the present. Eleanor watered the houseplants. Not on a schedule, but when she felt it was time. Harold cleaned the candles that they hadn't lit in weeks, but that were supposed to be left ready. They weren't expecting guests, cooking for anyone, making invitations. Gradually the street in front of the house grew noisier. The children appeared again with sleds, balls, without plans. Their voices reached the windows, but they didn't break the silence, they were part of it. Harold would sometimes look out the window and say, "These aren't grown up yet." Eleanor would nod sometimes, not in agreement, but as a way of feeling the connection between generations. A new quilt appeared in the long-unused guest room. Eleanor had made it from scraps of old things: shirts, pillowcases, curtains. She hadn't planned it for anyone, she just sewed it. Harold brought a pillow his mother had made and placed it under his head. They both knew that this space, even empty, had to be ready. Not for anyone in particular, but simply as a sign that the house was breathing. When the trees in the yard began to give shade without snow, Harold brought a small table from the old barn and set it by the window. Eleanor placed a single book on it, not to read, but to have it there. Thus they marked the beginning of a new period, not of spring, but of a brighter day. Their lives did not speed up. They flowed like a river, without banks, without noise, without leveling. They did not need to explain their actions, because they were done not for reasons, but out of silence. And this silence was not an absence but a profound presence.